Welcome to Brainish English Stories.
Once upon a time, in a place called Verona, there were two big families named Montague and Capulet. They were rich, and mostly, they were like other rich people. But they were very silly about one thing. They had an old argument, and instead of making up like sensible folks, they liked to keep the argument going. So if a Montague saw a Capulet on the street, they wouldn't talk to each other, or if they did talk, it was mean and rude, and sometimes they even fought. Even their family members and servants were just as silly. So, there were always fights and problems because of this Montague and Capulet argument. Now, Lord Capulet, the head of the Capulet family, threw a big party, a fancy dinner and a dance. He was so friendly that he said anyone could come except, of course, the Montagues. But there was a young Montague named Romeo who really wanted to go because Rosalind, the lady he loved, was invited. She had never been nice to him, and he had no good reason to love her. But the truth was, he wanted to love someone, and since he hadn't found the right lady, he ended up loving the wrong one. So, Romeo came to the big party at Capulet's house with his friends Mercutio and Benvolio. Lord Capulet welcomed Romeo and his two friends very nicely. Romeo, wearing a black mask over his eyes and nose, moved around the party with many other people dressed in fancy clothes, velvet and silk for the men with jewelry on their swords and collars, and the ladies wearing shiny gems on their chests and arms, with valuable stones in their beautiful belts. Even though Romeo had a mask on, everyone could tell he was much more handsome than anyone else in the room just by looking at his mouth, hair, and the way he carried himself. While he was dancing, Romeo noticed a lady who was incredibly beautiful and charming. From that moment on, he forgot all about Rosalind, the lady he thought he loved. He watched this new lady as she danced in her white satin dress with pearls. Compared to her, everything else seemed unimportant. He was probably saying something like that when Tybalt, Lady Capulet's nephew, recognized Romeo's voice. Tybalt was very mad and went to tell his uncle that an uninvited Montague, Romeo, had come to the party. But Lord Capulet was a true gentleman and didn't want to be rude to anyone in his own house, so he told Tybalt to calm down. But Tybalt was just waiting for a chance to start a fight with Romeo. In the meantime, Romeo got closer to the lovely lady and told her that he loved her. Just then, the lady's mother called her away. That's when Romeo found out that the lady he had fallen for was Juliet, Lord Capulet's daughter, the daughter of his sworn enemy. So, he left the party feeling sad but still in love with her. Then Juliet said to her nurse, "Who is that man who didn't want to dance?" "His name is Romeo, and he's from the Montague family, the enemies of your family," replied the nurse. Juliet then went to her room and looked out of her window at the beautiful garden lit by the soft moonlight. Without Juliet knowing, Romeo was hiding in the garden among the trees because he couldn't bear to leave without trying to see her again. She spoke her secret thoughts out loud to the quiet garden, confessing her love for Romeo. Romeo heard her words and felt very happy. Hidden below, he gazed up at her lovely face in the moonlight, framed by the blooming vines that surrounded her window. As he listened and watched, it felt as if he had been transported into a dream, placed in that enchanting garden by some magical force. "Why are you called Romeo?" Juliet wondered aloud. Since I love you, does your name really matter? Call me anything but Romeo, and I'll adopt a new name. From now on, I'll never be Romeo, he declared, stepping into the bright moonlight from the shadows of the cypress and oleander trees that had concealed him. At first, Juliet was frightened, but when she realized it was Romeo and not a stranger, she was filled with joy. He stood in the garden below, and she leaned out of the window, and they talked for a long time, each trying to find the sweetest words in the world to express their feelings, just like lovers do. Every word they spoke and the beautiful harmony of their voices together were recorded in a golden book. Time passed quickly, as it often does for people in love who are together. When the time came to say goodbye, it felt as though they had just met, and they hardly knew how to part. I'll send for you tomorrow, Juliet promised. With staying together and feeling very sad to say goodbye, they finally bid each other farewell. Juliet went back into her room, and a dark curtain covered her bright window. Romeo departed through the peaceful and dewy garden, feeling as though he were walking in a dream. The next morning, very early, Romeo went to Friar Lawrence, a priest, and told him the whole story. He asked the friar to marry him and Juliet without delay. After some discussion, the priest agreed. So when Juliet sent her old nurse to find out Romeo's plans for the day, the nurse returned with the message that everything was ready, and they would be married the following morning. The young lovers were scared to ask their parents if they could get married, like young people usually do, because of the silly old argument between the Capulets and the Montagues. Friar Lawrence was ready to help the young lovers secretly because he believed that once they were married, they could tell their parents, and it might bring an end to the old argument. So, early the next morning, Romeo and Juliet got married in Friar Lawrence's room and said their goodbyes with tears. Romeo promised to visit Juliet in the garden that evening, and the nurse prepared a rope ladder to lower from the window so Romeo could climb up and talk to his beloved wife in private. But something terrible happened that very day. Tybalt, the young man who had been so angry about Romeo going to the Capulets' party, met him and his friends, Mercutio and Benvolio, in the street. He called Romeo a bad person and challenged him to a fight. Romeo didn't want to fight with Juliet's cousin, but Mercutio drew his sword, and they fought. Sadly, Mercutio was killed. When Romeo saw his friend was dead, he forgot everything except his anger toward Tybalt, and they fought until Tybalt was killed too. So, on the day of their wedding, Romeo killed Juliet's cousin, and he was ordered to leave the city. Poor Juliet and her new husband met that night as planned. He climbed the rope ladder among the flowers and found her window. However, their meeting was sad, and they parted with tears and heavy hearts, because they didn't know when they would see each other again. Meanwhile, Juliet's father, who didn't know she was married, wanted her to marry a man named Paris. He got very angry when she refused and went to Friar Lawrence to ask for advice. The friar suggested that Juliet should pretend to agree to marry Paris, and he said, "I will give you a drink that will make you seem dead for 2 days. When they take you to the church, they will actually be taking you to your burial, not your wedding. They'll put you in a tomb, thinking you're dead, but before you wake up, Romeo and I will be there to take care of you. Are you willing to do this, or are you scared?" "I'll do it." "Don't talk to me about fear," said Juliet. She went home and told her father that she would marry Paris. If she had told her father the truth, well, then this story would have turned out differently. Lord Capulet was happy to have his way and started preparing for the wedding, inviting his friends and getting the feast ready. Everyone stayed up all night because there was so much to do and so little time. Lord Capulet thought that marrying Paris would make Juliet happy. Juliet was really sad about her husband Romeo, but her father thought she was upset because of her cousin Tybalt's death and believed that marriage would give her something else to focus on. Early in the morning, the nurse came to wake up Juliet and get her ready for her wedding. But Juliet wouldn't wake up, and at last, the nurse cried out suddenly, "Oh no! Oh no! Help! Help! My lady is dead! Oh, what a terrible day!" Lady Capulet rushed into the room, followed by Lord Capulet and Lord Paris, the groom. There lay Juliet, cold and pale, and no amount of crying could wake her up. So, instead of a wedding, they had a funeral that day. Meanwhile, Friar Lawrence had sent a messenger to Mantua with a letter for Romeo, explaining everything that had happened. But everything went wrong because the messenger was delayed and couldn't go. However, bad news spreads quickly. Romeo's servant, who knew about the marriage but not about Juliet's fake death, heard about her funeral and hurried to Mantua to tell Romeo that his young wife was dead and lying in the grave. "Is that true?" Romeo cried, his heart shattered. "Then I will lie beside Juliet tonight." So, he bought some poison and rushed back to Verona. He hurried to the tomb where Juliet was resting. It wasn't a regular grave, it was a vault. He broke open the door and was about to descend the stone steps leading to the vault where all the deceased Capulets were laid when he heard a voice behind him telling him to stop. It was Count Paris, who was supposed to marry Juliet that very day. "How dare you come here and disturb the deceased Capulets, you awful Montague!" Paris exclaimed. Poor Romeo, overwhelmed with grief, tried to respond calmly. "You were warned," said Paris, "that if you returned to Verona, you would die." "I must indeed," replied Romeo. "I came here for no other reason. Please, kind young man, leave me alone." "Oh, go away before I harm you. I care for you more than I care for myself. Go away and leave me here." Then Paris said, "I challenge you, and I arrest you as a criminal," and in his anger and sadness, Romeo drew out his sword. They fought, and Paris was killed. As Romeo's sword struck him, Paris cried out, "I am killed. If you have any kindness, open the tomb and place me next to Juliet." Romeo replied, "I promise I will." He carried the lifeless man into the tomb and laid him next to his beloved Juliet. Then he knelt beside Juliet, held her in his arms, and kissed her cold forehead, believing she was asleep. All the while, Juliet was slowly approaching the moment of her awakening. Romeo then drank the poison and passed away beside his beloved wife. Friar Lawrence arrived when it was too late and saw the tragic scene. Just as he understood what had happened, Juliet woke up from her sleep to find her husband and friend both lifeless beside her. The noise of the fight had attracted others to the location, and upon hearing them approaching, Friar Lawrence fled, leaving Juliet alone. She saw the cup that had held the poison and understood how everything had unfolded. Since there was no poison left for her, she took Romeo's dagger and stabbed herself in the heart. Falling with her head on Romeo's chest, she breathed her last. And so, the tale of these devoted yet sorrowful lovers comes to an end. When the older folks learned from Friar Lawrence about all that had happened, they grieved deeply. Seeing the terrible consequences of their senseless fight, they regretted their actions. Over the bodies of their deceased children, they finally reconciled, clasping hands in friendship and forgiveness.